The bright lights inside the massive arena were almost blinding, reflecting off the shiny outfits of thousands of people who had gathered for the biggest music event of the year. The air in the building was thick with excitement. You could feel it buzzing on your skin like static electricity. Everywhere you looked, people were waving glowing sticks and screaming at the top of their lungs, waiting for the main act to appear. This was the Night of Stars Charity Gala, a fancy event where wealthy people mixed with music lovers, all pretending to care about a good cause while mostly wanting to see famous celebrities. The crowd roared as the stage lights dimmed. A single spotlight hit the center of the stage. Smoke machines puffed out white clouds, and the heavy beat of a drum began to vibrate through the floorboards. Then he walked out. His name was Julian Vance, and right now he was the most famous singer on the planet. He wore a leather jacket covered in silver studs and sunglasses, even though he was indoors at night. He strutted to the center of the stage like he owned the world, grabbing his microphone stand and leaning back, letting the audience scream his name for a solid 3 minutes before he even sang a note. Julian was talented. Nobody could deny that. He had a voice that could hit high notes most people only dreamed of, and he had sold millions of albums. But along with that talent came an ego the size of the arena. Julian was known for being difficult. He was known for being rude to waiters, yelling at assistants, and acting like anyone who wasn't famous was beneath him. Tonight, however, the cameras were rolling, and he knew he had to play the part of the charming superstar. For the first hour of the show, everything went perfectly. Julian danced and spun around the stage, singing his hit songs while the crowd sang along. The band was tight, the backup dancers were perfect, and the light show was spectacular. It was a machine, well-oiled and expensive. But toward the end of the set, Julian started to get bored. You could see it on his face. He wasn't interacting with the audience the way he usually did. He was just going through the motions. He stopped the music abruptly after finishing a fast-paced pop song. The band cut out, leaving only the sound of 20,000 people breathing and murmuring. Julian took a sip of water from a fancy bottle, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked out into the sea of faces. "You guys are great tonight," Julian said into his microphone, his voice booming through the huge speakers. "Really great. But I feel like we need something spontaneous, don't you?" The crowd cheered, thinking he was about to announce a surprise guest or a new song. "I want to find someone," Julian continued, scanning the front row. The security guards near the stage shined their flashlights into the audience. "I want to find someone who loves music. Someone who maybe doesn't look like they belong here. Someone normal." His eyes scanned the crowd like a predator looking for prey. The front row was usually filled with VIPs, people who worked for the venue, radio contest winners, or wealthy fans who paid extra for the view. But right in the middle, there was a woman who stood out. While everyone else was wearing sequins, expensive dresses, or band t-shirts, she was wearing a plain beige cardigan and a pair of dark slacks. She had her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was holding a canvas tote bag on her lap. She looked like she had just come from the library or the grocery store. Julian pointed a gloved finger directly at her. "You," he said. "Yes, you." In the brown sweater, the woman looked around, confused. She pointed a finger at her own chest, mouthing the words, "Me." Julian laughed, a sound that was picked up by the microphone and echoed through the arena. "Yes, you. Don't be shy. Security, bring her up here." The crowd laughed too, but it was a nervous laughter. They didn't know what was happening. The security guard gently helped the woman over the barrier and guided her up the side stairs to the stage. She stumbled slightly as she stepped onto the shiny floor, clearly blinded by the spotlights. When she finally stood next to Julian, she looked tiny. Julian was tall and broad, wearing his leather and boots. She looked fragile and completely out of place. The spotlight hit her face. She squinted, shielding her eyes with her hand. She looked terrified. "What is your name?" Julian asked, holding the microphone to her face. The woman leaned in, her voice shaking. "Alina," she whispered. "Alina," Julian repeated, drawing the name out. "And what do you do, Alina? Are you a singer?" Alina shook her head quickly. No, I'm a librarian. I won the tickets. A librarian." Julian shouted, turning to the crowd. "See? I told you. A real person." He laughed again, and the audience laughed with him. It was funny in a way, seeing this ordinary woman standing next to the glitzy pop star. But Julian didn't stop there. He was riding the high of being the center of attention, and he wanted more. "Look at her," Julian said to the band, gesturing at Elena's clothes. "Very sensible. Very comfortable." He turned back to her. "Do you know what you're doing here, Elena?" "I just wanted to see the show," Elena said softly. She gripped her tote bag tighter, knuckles turning white. She tried to step back toward the stairs, but Julian blocked her path with a playful swing of his arm. "Oh no, you don't get off that easy," Julian said. "You're on stage now? We have to have some fun." He looked at the crowd. "Hey everyone, let's give a big hand for Elena, the librarian." The applause was polite but scattered. People were starting to feel a little uncomfortable. There was a vibe coming from Julian that wasn't just playful anymore. It was starting to feel mean. He was treating her like a prop, a joke to fill the last 10 minutes of the show. "So, Elena," Julian said, a smirk playing on his lips, "since you're a librarian, you must know a lot about books. But do you know anything about music? Or do you just listen to audiobooks?" The audience laughed, but it was quieter this time. Elena didn't smile. She looked down at her shoes. "I like music," she said quietly. "I bet you do," Julian said. "I bet you listen to those quiet, sad songs in the library, huh? But I wonder, can you sing?" Elena shook her head rapidly. "Please, I really don't want to sing. Come on." "Don't be boring." Julian groaned, rolling his eyes at the audience. "She's shy." "It's cute, right?" He walked around her, inspecting her like she was a piece of fruit at a supermarket. "I have a theory. I think people like you, people with simple lives. You have simple voices too, right? No power, no range, just quiet." He was mocking her. There was no question about it now. He was being a bully. "I think we should test my theory," Julian announced. He waved his hand at his band leader. "Hey, give her a mic. Let's let Elena sing for us." Stagehand ran out and handed Elena a microphone. It was heavy, and her hand trembled as she took it. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. She looked out at the dark arena, where 20,000 faces were staring back at her. "I don't know the words," Elena stammered. "I'll help you," Julian said, his voice dripping with fake kindness. "We are going to sing a classic. Everyone knows it, even librarians. It's Hallelujah. You know that one?" Elena nodded slowly. "Everyone knew that song." "Great," Julian said. He turned to the band. "Drop it down. Just a soft piano. Let the lady sing." The piano player began to play the slow, haunting introduction. The music drifted through the arena, beautiful and sad. Julian stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest, a wide grin on his face. He was ready to laugh. He was expecting her to squeak, to sing off-key, or to freeze up completely. He wanted a viral moment, a funny clip of the librarian failing that he could post on social media later. Elena stood there alone. The piano intro looped around for the second time. She lifted the microphone to her lips, but she couldn't make a sound. She looked at Julian, pleading with her eyes for him to let her go. But Julian just nodded his head, encouraging her to humiliate herself. "Sing." "Elena," he said into his mic, loud enough for everyone to hear. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the lights and the thousands of people. She took a shaky breath. She opened her mouth, and a small, thin sound came out. It was the first line of the song, but her voice cracked immediately. She rushed the tempo, trying to get the words out fast so it would be over. Julian didn't even wait for her to finish the line. He let out a loud, sharp "Ha!" into his microphone. The sound cut through the music like a knife. He signaled the band to stop playing abruptly. The piano died away. "Whoa, stop, stop," Julian yelled, putting his hands over his ears jokingly. The crowd laughed, thinking it was part of the act. I was right. "You don't have a musical bone in your body, do you, Elena?" Elena lowered the microphone, her face turning bright red. She felt hot tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She felt small. She felt like everyone was laughing at her, and in a way they were. "It's okay," Julian said, patting her on the shoulder in a way that wasn't comforting at all. "Not everyone can be a star. That's why you have a job, and I have this job." He turned to the crowd, raising his hands in victory. "And that, my friends, is why I am the singer, and she is the listener." The arena cheered for him. They cheered because the music was starting back up, and because they were conditioned to cheer when the star did something. But if you looked closely at the people near the front, you could see some of them weren't clapping. A few people were frowning. A few people crossed their arms. They didn't like seeing the woman treated like a joke, but their voices were drowned out by the noise of the party. Julian put his arm around Elena's shoulders, pulling her into a sweaty side hug for the cameras. He flashed a big white smile. "Give it up for Elena," he shouted. "Let's get her back to her books." He tried to steer her toward the stairs, eager to get back to his own songs. He thought the bit was done. He thought he had one. He had humiliated a stranger, boosted his own ego, and entertained the crowd for 5 minutes. To him, that was a successful night. But as he tried to move her off the stage, Elena planted her feet. She didn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, still holding the microphone. She looked at Julian, and for the first time, the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else. It was a look of quiet determination. She wasn't going to leave like this. She wasn't going to let him make her feel small for the rest of her life. She tapped Julian on the arm. He stopped and looked at her, annoyed. "What is it?" "The exit is that way," he pointed. Elena looked at him, and then she looked at the massive crowd. She leaned forward and spoke into the microphone, her voice shaky but loud enough to be heard. "No," she said. "I want to try again." Julian laughed, throwing his head back. "What? Are you serious?" "You just heard yourself." "I want to try again," she said, louder this time. Just once more. The crowd went quiet. The murmuring stopped. Everyone looked at the stage. Julian checked his watch, then looked at the woman. He was annoyed, but he also sensed an opportunity. If she failed again, it would be even funnier. "Fine," Julian said, shrugging. "If you want to embarrass yourself again, be my guest," he signaled the band. "All right, take it from the top. But let's see if she can actually stay on key this time." The piano player looked at Julian, then at Elena. He saw something in her face that made him play more softly this time. He played the intro slower, with more care. The drummer sat still, waiting. The backup singer stopped swaying and watched. Julian stood with his arms crossed, a smirk on his face, waiting for the disaster. But as the first notes of the song floated through the arena, nobody, not even Julian, was prepared for what was about to happen. Asterisk, the piano began to play again, filling the massive space with those familiar, sad chords. This time the music felt different. It wasn't just background noise for a joke. It felt heavy, like the air before a storm. Elena stood there in the center of the stage, clutching the microphone with both hands. Her knuckles were white, and you could see her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was terrified. Anyone would be. 20,000 people were staring at her, waiting for her to mess up again. The man standing next to her, Julian, the famous pop star, was practically vibrating with impatience. He had his arms crossed tightly over his chest and one foot tapping on the floor. He was grinning, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who knows they are about to win. Elena closed her eyes. She tried to imagine she was back in her apartment. She tried to pretend she was in her bathroom, singing into a hairbrush the way she did when no one was watching. But the smell of the stage, the dust, the heat from the lights, the faint smell of expensive cologne from Julian kept pulling her back to reality. She couldn't escape it. She was here, and she was the joke of the night. She opened her mouth to sing the first line. "I've heard there was a secret chord." Her voice came out shaky and thin, like a leaf blowing in the wind. It cracked on the word chord, wobbling up and down. She immediately tensed up trying to fix it, but that only made it worse. She sounded nervous, amateurish, and completely out of her depth. It was exactly the sound Julian had been hoping for. Julian didn't wait. He let out a loud, sharp laugh that boomed through the speakers, echoing off the back walls of the arena. It was a cruel sound, cutting right through the music. He shook his head, flipping his hair back, and looked at the audience with a, "Can you believe this?" expression. The crowd, following his lead, let out a ripple of giggles. It wasn't that they were bad people. It was just that they were caught up in the energy of the moment. When the star laughs, you laugh. That's how it works at these shows. "Stop, stop, stop," Julian yelled, waving his hand at the piano player. The music screeched to a halt. Oh, that was painful. My ears are bleeding. He rubbed his ears dramatically, pretending to be in pain. "I told you, didn't I? I said librarians are for reading, not singing." He stepped closer to Alina, invading her personal space. He leaned down so his face was right next to hers. "You tried, sweetie. You really did. But maybe, just maybe, leave the singing to the professionals, okay?" Alina felt the heat rush to her face again. It felt like her skin was on fire. She bit her lip hard, trying to keep the tears from falling. She felt so small, so stupid. Why had she agreed to come up here? Why did she think she could prove him wrong? She just wanted to disappear. She wanted to dissolve into the floor and wake up in her own safe, quiet bed. She lowered the microphone, ready to walk away, to take the shame and go back to her seat. But then, something happened inside her as she turned her head to look at the exit stairs. She saw the security guard standing there. He was looking at his phone, bored. Then she looked at the drummer. The drummer was looking at Julian with a weird expression on his face. Not admiration, but something else. He looked annoyed. Then Alina scanned the front row. She saw a young girl, maybe 10 years old, wearing a t-shirt with Julian's face on it. The girl was holding a sign that said, "Music is magic." But the girl wasn't laughing. She was looking right at Alina with big, serious eyes. The girl looked sorry for her. That look hit Alina like a punch in the stomach. She realized that if she walked away now, she wasn't just embarrassing herself. She was proving Julian right. She was proving to that little girl, and to everyone else, that if you aren't famous, if you aren't special, your voice doesn't matter. She was letting a bully win. A sudden burst of anger rose up in her chest, mixing with the shame. It wasn't a loud, screaming anger. It was a quiet, hard anger. It was the feeling of being pushed into a corner one too many times. She stopped walking. She planted her feet firmly on the stage floor. She thought about her life. She thought about the years she spent working in the library, being quiet, being helpful, being invisible. She thought about how she sang to herself when she was lonely, and how that singing was the only thing that made her feel real. She turned back around to face Julian. He was already talking to the audience, making another joke about how he needed earplugs. He wasn't paying attention to her anymore. He thought she was beaten. Alina took a deep breath. It was a shaky breath at first, but then it got deeper. She felt air filling her lungs all the way down to her stomach. She adjusted the stand. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't look at the exit. She looked straight ahead, into the darkness where the thousands of people were sitting. "Wait," she said. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't aggressive. But it was clear. Julian froze. He stopped mid-sentence. He turned his head slowly, looking at her like she was a bug that had suddenly started speaking English. The audience went quiet. The murmur died down instantly. Something was happening. You could feel the atmosphere shift in the arena. It went from a comedy show to something else entirely.
What did you say?
Julian asked, his voice dropping a bit. He looked confused. "I said wait," Alina said, louder this time. Her voice didn't shake this time. "You challenged me. You asked me to sing. I messed up because I was scared. Because you were laughing at me." The crowd gasped a little. "You weren't supposed to talk back to the star." But Alina continued, her eyes flashing. "I am done being scared. You want a song? I will give you a song." She didn't wait for him to give permission. She didn't wait for the band. She just nodded at the piano player, a small, sharp nod. The piano player looked at Julian. Julian stood there with his mouth slightly open, unsure of what to do. He waved his hand vaguely, a signal to just play. The piano player looked at Alina with new respect. He didn't play the introduction the way he usually did, the fast, poppy version. He played it the way it was written. Slow, reverent. He played the first few notes. They rang out clear and haunting. Alina lifted the microphone one last time. She closed her eyes, but not to hide. She closed them to focus. She reached down deep, past the fear, past the embarrassment, past the shaking knees. She found the place inside her where the music lived. It was a place she rarely let anyone see. She opened her mouth, and the first note came out. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. The note was low and rich, like warm honey or dark chocolate. It didn't crack. It didn't shake. It held steady, filling the entire arena. It was a voice that sounded like it had lived 1,000 years. It was a voice that had seen sadness and joy and everything in between. I've heard there was a secret chord. She sang the first line perfectly. But it wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was the way she sang them. She didn't sing it like a pop star, trying to show off how high she could go or how fast she could run. She sang it like she was telling a secret. She sang it like she was pouring her heart out onto the floor. Julian uncrossed his arms. The smirk vanished from his face instantly. He turned his body fully toward her, his eyes widening behind his sunglasses. He looked like someone who had just seen a ghost. He recognized talent. Even with his massive ego, he knew what a real voice sounded like. And this was real. Alina kept singing. She moved into the second line, and her voice grew stronger. That David played, and it pleased the Lord. By the time she got to the chorus, the entire arena was silent. Completely, totally silent. You couldn't hear a cough, or a whisper, or a phone ring. 20,000 people were holding their breath. The people in the nosebleed seats leaned forward. The security guards stopped looking at their phones. The backup singers stopped checking their makeup. The song was difficult. It required you to go to a high emotional place. Most professional singers struggled with it, but Alina didn't struggle. She seemed to float up to those high notes effortlessly. She didn't force them. She just let them happen. She opened her eyes as she sang, looking out at the crowd, and for a moment, it felt like she was looking right into the soul of every single person there. She wasn't the librarian anymore. She wasn't the shy woman in the cardigan. She was a force of nature. She stood tall, her shoulders back, holding the microphone like it was a weapon of light. Julian took a step back. He felt small. He looked at his expensive boots, then at his shiny jacket, and suddenly he felt ridiculous. He realized that he had painted his face and styled his hair and used computers to fix his voice. Just to hide the fact that he didn't have half the soul this woman had. He was a product, a package. She was the real thing. He watched her mouth moving, forming the words of the ancient song. He saw a single tear roll down her cheek as she sang about a broken throne. But she didn't wipe it away. She let it fall. The band members looked at each other, nodding slowly. The drummer picked up his sticks, but he didn't play a beat. He just tapped the rims of his drums softly, adding a heartbeat to her voice. The bass player stopped playing the melody and started playing a slow, deep hum that vibrated in everyone's chest. They were backing her up now, not because they had to, but because they wanted to be part of this moment. Julian looked out at the audience. He saw a man in the front row wiping his eyes. He saw two teenage girls holding hands, their mouths open in shock. The laughter was gone. The mocking was gone. In its place was something rare, a moment of pure, unfiltered honesty. The crowd was mesmerized. They were witnessing a transformation. They were watching a person find their power in the most unlikely place. Julian realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had tried to break her, thinking she was weak. But he had pushed her, and instead of breaking, she had turned into steel. He had awakened a giant. And as her voice soared to the climax of the verse, echoing off the high ceiling of the arena, Julian knew that his night of stardom was over. This wasn't his show anymore. It was hers. And there was nothing he could do but stand there, listen, and feel the truth of her voice cut through all his lies. Asterisk, as the final word of the verse hung in the air. The silence in the arena grew heavier. It wasn't an awkward silence anymore. It was the kind of quiet you feel when you walk into an ancient cathedral. People were afraid to breathe, scared that the slightest noise might break the spell she was weaving. Julian stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. He was looking at Elena, really looking at her for the first time, as if he were seeing a completely different person. The arrogance had been wiped off his face, replaced by a look of total confusion. He couldn't figure out where this power was coming from. He was used to auto-tune and backing tracks, too loud beats, and flashing lights that distracted people from the actual singing. This was none of that. This was just a voice, raw and unpolished, and it was more beautiful than anything he had ever heard. Elena didn't stop. She didn't wait for the crowd to applaud. She didn't wait for Julian to tell her she did a good job. She just kept going. She moved into the next verse, her voice dropping lower, becoming softer and more intimate. She sang about the brokenness of people, about the cold and the holy, and the way she shaped the words made them feel physical. You could almost see the story she was telling unfolding in the air above the stage. She sang like she was pouring out everything she had ever held back, every lonely night in the library, every book she read but never shared, every feeling she ever suppressed. It was painful to listen to, but in a way that felt good. Like cleaning a deep wound, the band, sensing the shift, began to change how they played. The piano player, who had been playing the standard chords, started to improvise. He added little flourishes, delicate notes that danced around Elena's voice, supporting her without overpowering her. He was watching her face, following her tempo, letting her lead him. The drummer stopped using his sticks and started using his hands, gently tapping a soft heartbeat rhythm on the rims of the drums. Even the backup singers, who usually just swayed and looked pretty, were standing still, mesmerized, their microphones lowered. They knew they couldn't add anything to this. They were just witnesses now. Julian looked at his band. He saw the way they were looking at Eleanor's Specht. Oh, wonder. It was a look they had never given him. He realized then that, while he was the star, he was just the frontman for a machine. Elena was the music. She was standing there, in her cheap cardigan, with her eyes closed, completely exposed, and she was stronger than everyone in that room. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a tight feeling that he hadn't felt in years. It was shame. He looked down at his boots, unable to watch her anymore, because her voice was making him feel things he didn't want to feel. Then came the chorus, the famous part of the song, the part where most singers try to scream and belt it out to show off their range. Elena didn't scream. She didn't force it. She just opened her mouth, and the sound poured out like liquid gold. It was effortless. She held a high note that seemed to go on forever, clear and steady as a bell, resonating through the entire stadium. It was so pure that it didn't even echo. It just filled the space and settled there. The crowd reacted physically. You could see people putting their hands over their hearts. You could see heads bowing. Near the front, a man in a business suit was openly weeping, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. The little girl with the sign was no longer waving it. She was staring up at Elena with wide eyes, her mouth open in a perfect O. It was the kind of moment that doesn't happen often in life. A moment where everyone stops thinking about themselves and connects to something bigger. Julian realized he had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and let his own show be stolen from him completely. His ego was bruised, but his instincts as a performer were kicking in. He needed to get back some control. He thought about grabbing his microphone and singing along, trying to overpower her. He thought about cutting the music and taking a bow. But when he opened his mouth to speak, no words came out. The air felt too thick. It felt like any noise he made would be an insult to what was happening next to him, so, for the first time in his career, he did the hardest thing possible for a man like him. He stepped back. He physically moved away from the center of the stage, retreating into the shadows. He took off his sunglasses, exposing his eyes to the bright lights. He looked vulnerable. He signaled the lighting director, waving his hand to tell them to change the lights. The technician, confused at first, finally understood. He killed the harsh, flashing strobe lights. He killed the spinning spotlights. He dimmed everything until there was just one single warm spotlight shining down on Elena. Julian stood in the dark, just watching her. Elena didn't notice any of this. She was lost in the song. She was reaching the climax now, the part where the music swells and the emotion peaks. She raised her head, her eyes still closed, tears streaming freely down her face now, glistening in the spotlight. She didn't care about the makeup she wasn't wearing. She didn't care about her plain clothes. She wasn't the librarian anymore. She was a vessel for the song. The piano player hit the keys harder, building the tension. The drummer added a soft rumble of thunder. Elena's voice soared above it all, powerful and fragile all at once. She sang the word hallelujah, not as a shout of joy, but as a cry of surrender. It was the most heartbreakingly beautiful sound anyone in that arena had ever heard. Julian watched her from the shadows. He realized he wasn't the star of this story. He was the villain. And for the first time, he was okay with that, because the performance he was watching was worth more than his entire career. He realized that true talent isn't about how many records you sell or how famous you are. It's about truth. And standing on that stage in a simple beige cardigan, Alina was the most truthful thing in the world. As the final note of the verse approached, the band held their breath. They were building up to the final, most intense part of the song. The crowd was leaning forward, waiting. The silence was stretching, becoming thinner, vibrating with anticipation. Alina took a deep, shuddering breath, ready to pour everything she had left into the final moment. She was about to finish the song, and Julian knew, deep down, that nothing in his life would ever be the same after this night. Alina reached the most difficult part of the song. The part where the music climbs high and the singer has to push their voice to the very limit. This was the moment where most people would fail. It was the moment where the famous pop stars usually rely on backing tracks to help them carry the note. But Alina didn't have a backing track. She didn't have a safety net. She just had her own voice and the quiet rhythm of the piano behind her. She closed her eyes tighter, tilting her head back slightly, exposing the soft skin of her neck to the bright lights. She looked incredibly vulnerable, like a flower standing in a storm. Yet there was a steel rod of strength running right through her. She sang the word hallelujah. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a scream. It was a long, sustained note that seemed to hang in the air like a ribbon of gold. She held it. And she held it. The note didn't waver. It didn't shake. It just kept going, filling every corner of the massive arena. It was a sound that felt like it was vibrating in your bones. People in the very back rows, who could barely see her face, stood up. They just stood up, as if pulled by a magnetic force. They needed to see where this sound was coming from. They couldn't believe that a human voice could be that powerful without any help from machines. The effect on the crowd was like watching a wave crash over a beach. You could see the change sweep from the front to the back. The young girls stopped looking at their phones. The drunk guys stopped talking to each other. The security guards stopped checking the exits. Every single pair of eyes was fixed on that small woman in the beige cardigan. It was total silence. The kind of silence that is so heavy, it feels like a physical weight pressing down on your ears. Nobody wanted to miss a single second of this. Julian stood in the shadows just off stage. He was close enough to see the details of her face. He saw the tears streaming down her cheeks, catching the light and glistening like diamonds. He saw the way her hands gripped the microphone stand so tightly her knuckles were white. He saw her chest heaving with the effort of pouring her soul into the song. He felt a strange pain in his own chest, a lump in his throat that made it hard to swallow. He realized he had never seen anyone sing like this. He had been performing for 20 years and he had never given this much of himself to an audience. He always held something back. He was always worried about his image, about looking cool, about hitting the right pitch. Alina wasn't worried about any of that. She was just emptying herself out, giving everything she had to the music. He looked down at his hands. The hands that had held a microphone in front of millions of people. He felt a deep sense of shame. He remembered how he had laughed at her. He remembered the cruel jokes he had made about her clothes, her job, her simple life. He realized now how empty his own life was compared to hers. He had the fame, the money, the private jets, and the fans, but he didn't have that raw, honest connection. He was a manufactured product, a plastic wrapper. She was the real thing. He felt small. He felt like a fraud. The ego that usually drove him had shrunk down to nothing, leaving him feeling exposed and guilty, The music swelled again as the piano player repeated the melody, building up for the final climax. Alina took a deep, ragged breath that the microphone picked up, making everyone hold their breath with her. She wasn't singing words anymore. She was singing sounds, pure vowels, that expressed more emotion than 1,000 speeches ever could. It was a sound of heartbreak, but also of hope. It was a sound of resilience. It was the sound of someone who had been underestimated their entire life finally standing up and shouting, "I am here!" Julian took a step forward. He wanted to stop it. He wanted to grab the mic and end it because it was too painful to watch. It was too real. He felt like he was intruding on a private moment, like he was watching something he wasn't supposed to see. But he couldn't move his legs. He was rooted to the spot. He was paralyzed by the beauty of it. He realized that he couldn't stop this. He had lost control of his show, and he didn't deserve to get it back. He had to let her finish. He had to let her have this moment. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. It was a single sniffle from someone in the front row. Then, another person coughed. Then, a woman near the stage let out a quiet sob. The dam broke. The emotional tension in the arena was too much for people to hold inside. People started crying. Not just a few people, but hundreds of them. Grown men in leather jackets were wiping their eyes. Teenagers were burying their faces in their hands. Even the camera operators, who were usually bored and cynical, were looking through their viewfinders with misty eyes. It wasn't just a concert anymore. It was a shared human experience. It was a moment of mass catharsis. All these strangers, all these different people, were united by the voice of one woman who had been brave enough to be herself. Julian saw the drummer. The drummer was a big, tough guy who usually wore a scowl. He was looking at Alina with his mouth open, his drumsticks resting on his knees. He looked like he had just seen a miracle. The bass player was shaking his head slowly in disbelief. Even the backup dancers, who were usually focused on their next move, were standing perfectly still, their arms crossed, completely mesmerized. Julian realized that his entire band knew it too. They all knew they were witnessing history. They all knew they would never forget this night as long as they lived. Alina began to slow down. She was nearing the end. The piano player softened his touch, playing the notes more gently now, like rain falling on a roof. Alina's voice dropped from the high, soaring notes down to a whisper. She sang the final lines of the song so softly that the audience had to lean forward to hear her. It was intimate, like she was whispering a secret to each person individually. And even though it all went wrong, I'll stand before the Lord of Song, with nothing on my tongue but hallelujah. She held the final word. Hallelujah. She sang it as a whisper, fading away into nothingness. She held the note until there was no sound left, until she was just mouthing the word, her lips moving in the silence. Then she let her hands drop from the microphone stand. She lowered her head. Her chest was heaving. It was over. The silence that followed was absolute. It was terrifyingly quiet. For about 5 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The air seemed to vibrate with the ghost of her voice. It was the kind of silence that happens when something so profound has just occurred that your mind needs a moment to process it. It was the silence of respect. Julian stood there, his tears finally streaming down his own face, wiping them quickly with the back of his hand, embarrassed that his makeup was running. He looked at Alina, who stood with her head bowed, looking exhausted and small again. He felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him. He wanted to go over there and put a jacket around her shoulders. He wanted to apologize to her. He wanted to tell the whole world that he was wrong and she was right. But before he could do anything, the silence broke. It started as a clap. One person. Then another. Then 10. Then 100. And then, suddenly, it exploded. The noise was deafening. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar. It was a sound like a jet engine taking off. The audience rose to their feet as one. They stomped their feet. They screamed. They shouted bravo. An encore. The noise was so loud that the floor shook. Lighters and phone flashers turned on all over the arena, creating a sea of stars that twinkled in the darkness. It was a tidal wave of love and appreciation crashing over the stage, aimed directly at the woman in the cardigan. The sound that hit the stage was like a physical wave. It wasn't just a polite applause. It was a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the arena. 20,000 people were on their feet, screaming, clapping, and crying. The noise was so loud that the windows of the VIP boxes rattled. It was the kind of sound that usually only happened when a rock star finished a 2-hour set. Not when a simple woman in a cardigan finished a single song. But this wasn't just applause. It was a release. The crowd had been holding their breath for 5 minutes, and now they were letting it all out in an explosion of emotion. Alina stood in the center of the spotlight, looking completely bewildered. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling, sweat glistening on her forehead. She looked out at the sea of people, her eyes wide. For a moment, she didn't understand what was happening. She had just poured her heart out, exposed her soul, and sung the most important song of her life. Now, looking at the thousands of faces screaming for her, the reality of the moment began to sink in. She wasn't a librarian anymore. She wasn't the butt of a joke. She was the queen of this arena. Julian stood frozen in the shadows for a moment longer. He wiped his face one last time, trying to compose himself. He looked at his band, who were all looking at him, waiting for a cue. They were confused. The set list was done. They were supposed to play one more upbeat dance number and say goodnight, but Julian knew that was impossible. You can't play a cheesy pop song after what just happened. It would be like spitting in the face of a masterpiece. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped out of the darkness. As he walked into the light, the crowd's volume seemed to dip slightly, then spike again. They were cheering for him too, but it was different now. They were cheering because he was part of this moment, the one who had let it happen. Julian walked over to Alina. He didn't swagger. He didn't pose for the cameras. He walked slowly, almost reverently. He looked like a man walking into a church. He reached out and gently touched Elena's shoulder. She flinched slightly, then turned to look at him. Up close, she could see that his eyes were red. The sunglasses were gone. The arrogant smirk was gone. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in all the years she had seen him on TV. It was an expression of total humility. Julian reached for the microphone that was still on the stand. Alina let go of it. He held it for a moment, then looked at the crowd, raising his hand to ask for silence. It took a long time for the noise to die down. People were still shouting her name. Alina, Alina. It was a chant now. When the arena finally quieted down to a murmur, Julian looked at the microphone, then back at Alina. He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong," Julian said. His voice cracked slightly. He didn't try to hide it. "I was so wrong." He turned to face the audience completely, keeping one hand on Elena's shoulder. "I make my living singing," Julian said, his voice echoing through the quiet hall. "I have sold millions of records. I have played in stadiums all over the world. But I have never in my life heard anything like that." He paused, looking down at the floor. "I tried to make a joke of her. I tried to make her feel small, because I thought that would make me look big, and I am ashamed of that." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "I came out here tonight to be the star," Julian continued. "But tonight, I am just the fan. I am just another person who was lucky enough to be in the room when magic happened." He looked at Alina, his eyes serious. "You have a gift, Alina. A gift that cannot be taught, cannot be bought, and cannot be faked. Thank you for sharing it with us." He turned back to the band and signaled them. He didn't signal the upbeat ending. He signaled for the pianist to play the soft melody again. He looked at Alina and held the microphone out to her, inviting her to take it. He stepped back, lowering his head, surrendering the stage to her. Alina looked at the microphone, then at Julian, then at the crowd. She felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She realized that the bully had been defeated, not by fighting, but by truth. She smiled, a genuine, bright smile that lit up her face. She took the microphone. "Thank you," she said simply. "And thank you, Julian, for letting me sing." She raised the microphone for one last note, but she didn't sing. She just held it there, and the crowd erupted again, cheering louder than ever. She didn't need to sing another word. The song was finished. Julian walked over and bowed to her. Not a polite bow, but a deep, respectful bow from the waist. Then he took her hand and raised it high in the air, like a champion prizefighter. The lights flashed, the cameras snapped, and the image was burned into history. The polished pop star and the simple librarian standing side by side. But with her clearly on top, Alina stood there for another minute, soaking it in. She let the applause wash over her like a warm shower. She knew she would have to go back to the library eventually. She knew she had to go back to her normal life. But she also knew that she would never be the same. She had faced her fear. She had faced a giant, and she had won. She had found her voice, and she had used it to touch the hearts of thousands. Slowly, she began to walk toward the stairs. Every step she took, the crowd cheered. The security guard who had looked bored earlier was now holding the door open for her, beaming with pride. The backup dancers clapped their hands over their heads. As she reached the stairs, she turned back one last time. Julian was standing in the middle of the stage, watching her go. He raised a hand and waved goodbye. No tricks, no jokes. Just a wave. She walked down the stairs and into the dark hallway beneath the arena. The sound of the crowd was muffled here, but she could still hear them chanting her name. A young woman with a headset ran up to her, looking breathless. "That was amazing," the woman said, her eyes wide. "The producers are going crazy. They want to talk to you." "Record labels are already calling." Lena just smiled and held her canvas tote bag tight. She wasn't thinking about record labels. She wasn't thinking about fame. She was thinking about how good it felt to be heard. Back on stage, Julian watched the empty spot where she had been standing. The band was packing up their instruments, the roadies were moving equipment, and the lights were coming up. The magic spell was broken, and the arena was turning back into a noisy, cluttered building. But Julian felt different. He felt lighter, as if a heavy weight he had been carrying for years had been lifted off his shoulders. He realized that he didn't have to be the arrogant jerk anymore. He realized that there was something more important than being a star. It was called being human. He walked to the front of the stage one last time. The crowd was mostly leaving now, streaming toward the exits, still buzzing with excitement. But a few hundred people remained, looking up at him. "Good night, everyone," Julian said into the mic. "And remember, listen to the quiet ones. Sometimes they have the loudest voices." He dropped the microphone on the stand one last time, turned and walked off the stage. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the night was over, but the memory of the librarian who sang like an angel would stay with him forever. And somewhere in the city, walking home with the sound of applause still ringing in her ears, Lena finally felt like she belonged in the world.